So thank you, Francisca, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for this opportunity to share kind of my thoughts and some of the work that we've been doing. I'm going to start by kind of motivating a little bit. You know, many of you already know kind of the state of this, what we're seeing in the world in terms of the growing number of people with disability and the limited number of therapists. And so, of course, my philosophy as an engineer is that we can definitely use technology to bridge these gaps. And the type of systems that we've been kind of working on are kind of situated in two realms. In the therapy robot space, we've been focusing on neurological disorders, mainly due to non-traumatic brain injury. And then we've started with stroke and then started branching into HIV and some work with infants that are at risk for cerebral palsy. And we've been focused on how do we use robots, simple and more complex ones, to do assessment of disability and impairment, and also to think about delivering autonomous and semi-autonomous therapy. We've also been kind of focusing in the assistant robotics spaces in terms of developing simple devices that could be used in and outside the hospital, and focusing on how do we use them in terms of the interaction with them to observe or monitor behavior, to maybe elicit a certain type of behaviors, and then utilize different methods to try to quantify that behavior that's happening in the real world. I always like to put this slide up because sometimes I get, depending on the audience, I know this is not the audience that would think that, is this idea of, well, are you trying to take my job? No, if you're a clinician in this room, I'm not trying to take your job. My philosophy is that human-robot interactions should be shared. And, you know, Jeremy mentioned this idea of shared control. And then we've been kind of thinking about, you know, we're putting the robot into these contexts. And so whether the therapist is demonstrating something, and how do they use the robot as an ally, as a smart assistant, and no matter where and what the therapist is doing, whether they're demonstrating actions, helping in terms of movement or observing, if the robot has that particular role, the robot is there as a shared tool to augment the experience for the patient. So the thought was computational methods, of course, are needed to try to disambiguate a lot of these issues that we've been talking about today. So my objective was to present representative cases and to discuss some challenges and opportunities. And through the different representative cases, I'll kind of touch on where we are, what we tried to do. I realized, whoa, you know, I'm like all over the place. I've been interested in a lot of different things. So I'm going to talk about cases where we are using these methods or needing to use these methods to provide insight into human-human interactions on real tasks in the wild. And our primary goal has been to learn the human-human movements during therapy, task-related therapy, by demonstration to guide human-robot therapy. And we've tried different methods, and I kind of will, you know, talk a little bit about that. So the other thing is to talk about improving the precision of robot-based therapy in real time. I think some people have talked about human in the loop, et cetera. How do we do that? And one first thing was, how do we provide objective measures of behavior where there's limited trained clinicians? One of our goals is using more affordable robots, and the idea that these robots would be in kind of community-based environments, in global environments like Botswana and other places that are low and middle income countries characterized by low resource settings. And how do we extract objective metrics from those? And then how do we even provide insight into using these types of robots to enhance, say, for example, a telepresence visit or remote activity. The other goal is to provide and use these methods that we realize we need to use these methods in providing insight into human behavior and functional status in the wild. I keep saying in the wild, but basically kind of in less curated spaces. And two ways that I'll talk about is automatically trying to assess motor delay and trying to automatically classify interaction behaviors and some of the challenges that are needed. So let's start with the first idea. So when we began this, I worked, my philosophy being in PM&R had put me in a unique space of kind of straddling the more clinical side of things and really talking very closely to clinicians. I've been working with occupational therapists a lot because of the upper extremity. And one study we did was looking at and trying to study real activities, real interaction between an OT and different types of therapists. And our initial goal when we began was, could we code this? Because I wanted the occupational therapy colleague, Dr. Mendonça, her students did a lot of the coding to kind of identify what are not just the movement kinematics and the haptics kinematics. That was, I told her, my specialty. I can extract those, we can measure those in different ways. But one of the things that I realized that we didn't really know was about the cueing and how these behaviors and different movements occur while there's a lot of physical and descriptive and verbal and administrative cues happening. We really wanted to understand how these cues integrate with the movement and the interaction that's occurring. So one of the things that we realized as we were doing this and the paper we published was that, yes, there were three kind of major roles that came out of these interactions: the therapist as demonstrator, therapist as observer, and the therapist as helper. And that really, when we look at the robotics interactions or the robots that we've actually developed robot observers, robot monitors, robots that do the observing and monitoring, and then robots that actually do helping where they're permanently attached. But one of the things we haven't done really good job of maybe is thinking about robots that may be able to transition in all these three places, from observer to monitor to helper and back, or robots that do a lot of contact to non-contact interactions. But after we did this initial study of just looking at these tasks, we were realizing that manual coding is not the answer. It is, we do it, but it is really, time intensive, and that we needed ways to reliably curate these videos, to use pose algorithms. We needed to understand the diversity of motions involved in different ADL tasks. And in fact, we're grappling with the data set now and what we can kind of interpret and extract. And then one of the key things is identifying sensitive metrics that can capture these interactions and movements. And then the next question is, how do we inform robots in terms of these roles? We have a grant from Restore to kind of follow up on this initial manual study that we were doing and trying to think through how we can use the videos that we had curated and how we can then use machine learning to extract how the therapists and the patients are interacting with each other. And one of the things we wanted to do was to use pose algorithms to extract the kinematics in the interaction and then try to analyze whether this interaction was a demonstrated interaction. I know the video is kind of, the picture is kind of small, a demonstrating interaction, an observing interaction, or a helping interaction. Could you do that automatically? And if we could do that automatically, what about this type of interaction? Are there anything that we can use or identify as a sensitive metric that could feed to the robot to let them know, hey, we're transitioning from this role to the other, how to direct the robot to transition. One of the challenges in this activity, and you'll notice, is occlusion. So oftentimes pose algorithms are getting better and better and better, and we acknowledge that, but most of the time you see them identifying people by themselves. And in this integration, human-human interaction, people are working closely with each other. So occlusion is basically par for the course. And how do we get meaningful information while dealing with this occlusion is a part of the issue. So we've kind of tried to implement a process where we were We curated about 100 or so of these videos off the internet. Some of them we took ourselves, and then we tried to use a couple of different machine learning methods, deep lab cut, and and we also use just the standard pose algorithm out of Carnegie Mellon, and we try to kind of have them help us deal with marker dropout, the labeling of the kinematics of the upper extremity, and then what we also collected some demographic data as much as we could, and then tried to process the video by extracting a couple of metrics. We were looking at the area formed by the two upper limbs of the upper limb of the patient combined with the upper limb of the therapist, and looking at how that area changes over time, as well as looking at the correlations between the movement of the patient's hand and the movements of the therapist. We're still actually in the process of kind of finalizing this, but one of the things that we realized was your pose, the goodness of computational method is really based on the data that you put in, right? So the challenge of getting really good, reliable data to also get really good pose estimates is quite difficult. And when we're working with data that is collected by other people, the challenge is you don't know anything about the camera, what's the field of view, there's people zooming in and zooming out, you can't control all those things. And what we're learning is that all those activities affect the integrity of the position data that you can extract from these images. And so, and also the huge diversity of the upper extremity in terms of ADL function and movement has also caused a challenge. So when we saying, well, what we're trying to do now is there some sense of grouping in terms of the ADLs that allow us to kind of put our arms around the diversity in the metrics that we're seeing. So this is definitely something that's needed. I think a challenge is how do we do that well? And we're now trying to work with a colleague that does deep learning to try to maybe use those methods to try to make sense out of the variety of data. It still takes a long time. So I thought, well, manual coding is one thing, but reducing the time to evaluate videos or even using ML techniques still requires a lot of time to train, a lot of time to label. So there needs to be work done in that. Identifying the sensitive metrics are confounded by all these unknowns that happen when you're dealing with real data set. And one of the things is thinking about the role of haptic information in terms of this interaction between the human and human. How does that contribute to changing the relationship of the movement? And again, ways of taking this and extracting this onto therapists. Onto robots. The other thing that we've been thinking about is how do we do autonomous robot-assisted physical therapy? Let's remember I said that thinking about robots that move from contact or non-contact to contact, from observing to helping. Our initial ideas were kind of implementing some basic methods of having a therapist demonstrate, for example, a drinking task, use that to collect or define a trajectory of motion. And we did some 2D simple Gaussian regression techniques to define a bound around that trajectory, and then implement a decision-making algorithm to say when should the robot intervene and how to intervene. And in this case, we were using the Baxter and built kind of a special arm, not necessarily a humanoid arm, but just to think that you're coming in and lifting. The other, in this work with Dr. Kuchenbecker and her and Nick, the student, we collaborated to look at this idea from using a PR2 robot. And the idea was thinking about simple, how do we learn from demonstration in this version? How do we learn the movements? Can the therapist teach the movements? We looked at 1 degree of freedom, a 2 degree of freedom, and kind of something that mimics the ADL exercise where you're lifting something up and putting it down. One of the key ideas was to try to kind of use Gaussian mixture models and Gaussian mixture regression models to say, well, if we implemented a time-based type model of the therapist movement, and what we did was had the therapist demonstrate, and then the stroke survivor then did and completed the task. And we collected then both that information. And so the idea then also was either to implement more of a state-based model where we're using information about the forces and how the person's interacting with the object in order to define how the robot should support the movement. There were challenges in these methods. I think, again, it keeps coming up, the variability in the task. And if you want to do real ADLs in the 1D, 2D, and the point-to-point movement case that I just discussed with the demonstration in this previous study, was even with those cases, the control that was then mapped and learned looked very different for the 1 degree of freedom from the 2 degree of freedom from the 3 degree of freedom task, and that the therapists and patients had like different points of view in terms of how they preferred the movement with the control implementation, and that we needed to kind of think through how best to develop algorithms that would be consistent across these types of ADL tasks. So I think there's opportunity to think through that as well. Learning the model is coming up. I'm now collaborating with a colleague thinking it through model predictive control strategies and trying to think through whether we can have new ways of learning the control of movement for the robot to be able to come from a non-contact space to a contact space, to go from observer to helper, from monitor to support of the person's limb. So quickly, let me go through. So improving the precision of robot-based methods in real time. One of the things we were doing was thinking about the fact that robot therapy is often limited to people with primarily motor function, and thinking about how do we include cognitive patients with cognitive issues within this context, and then how do we use that information to do therapy on the fly. The question that we've been looking at is, what are relevant features that are needed to assess the human-robot interaction, to adapt the exercises based on both cognitive and motor behavior. We've kind of looked at two different groups, stroke survivors, kind of thinking about how their cognitive impairment influences their performance of upper extremity motor tasks. We know that stroke survivors have persistent cognition issues and motor issues, psychosocial issues, et cetera. And oftentimes we characterize them mainly by their motor function, but exclude those with more than mild cognitive issues. So what if we include those with moderate issues into the equation? Can we begin to figure out what features would allow us to detect that and then maybe adjust the therapeutic activity of the robot to accommodate those cognitive issues? So we also did some work with HIV. And the reason we came to HIV was we were doing some work globally with Botswana, and Botswana is in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a lot of HIV is a communicable disease that was really plaguing Africa. And we found that a lot of the stroke survivors there, about a third of them also had HIV. And then we also realized that HIV was a huge risk factor for stroke. So we then started looking at the intersection of HIV and stroke, and then HIV alone, and trying to use this as a model for kind of examining this interaction between motor and cognitive impairment. Here we, relied on, because we're in the clinical space, is talking to clinicians about, well, what are the clinical metrics to assess motor outcomes, cognitive assessment, and implementing these battery of metrics at the beginning, and then using and developing simple robot assessment tasks that we could use with our 1 degree of freedom haptic system that we developed. And the reason for using this particular robot is because it was affordable, and we can develop it. It's developed in the US, but we can port it to Botswana and different places without having to expect that they would have a $60,000 or $80,000 robot. So that was our motivation. So kind of this is like a tracking assessment task. And this was the task that my student had developed, we call it a spatial span task that was riffing off of cognitive task called the Corsi block task. And so in this task, and this is pretty much the part that's most unusual, is you identify a sequence, and then you're asked to move the robot to the sequence to complete the sequence in order. This is what the data would look like, and then this is the data that that would look like in terms of the spatial span. The metric that we've been really examining is this mean sequence metric. And what we see is that the mean sequence metric is able to actually separate people with cog function only. You notice that the people with no impairment, we can see that they're able to do higher sequences. We also see that cognitive function interferes with motor performance, because we can't tell the difference between those with cog-only impairment and those with motor-only impairment. And then those with motor and cog performs the worst. So using these metrics, our goal is to be able to then predict the clinical metrics and determine which of these we can use on the fly. What we've noticed is that, for example, the sequence length predicts color trails 2, which is a simple metric for looking at executive function. We also look at the MoCA executive function subscore, and we see that this spatial span sequence length is also able to account for a moderate amount of the variability that we see in those clinical data. And then we also were able to kind of predict and develop a metric for the box and block, to say, well, how does the activity on the box and block relate to the gross motor function? So key thing then is also thinking about how do we do social robot augmented telepresence. I'm going to move a little faster. I see that you stood up. So in terms of thinking about target touch, how do we use computer-based assessments? In the wild, we've done some work with our social robot systems here, and thinking through collecting this type of data, collecting videos, and then wanting to understand how those related to clinical metrics of like the box and block and color trails, executive function. My grad student tried to do a look at kind of whether you could extract these data sets, these kinematic data sets from the videos, and correlate them to box and block measures and color trails. We had mixed reviews, and I think the key thing here is, again, how do you, the key thing, again, is determining which clinical data that you could use, and that the data set was quite noisy. The last piece is this idea of providing early and late insights into human behaviors and functional status. This work we've been doing with infants and kind of thinking about how do you predict motor delay using from video and interaction with our toy devices. In this case, just looking just at camera data, we were able to show that we could sort and separate high-risk infants from the healthy infants, but we were having trouble separating out the infants that were at low risk from the infants that were moderate risk. So we then proposed to actually do a variety of different tasks, where now we're in this process of collecting a lot of data from full-term infants, preterm infants. We collect them in this mechatronic system with also, we have a toy. We're collecting their pressure information as well as all the different views of their camera information. And now what we're trying to do is, from all this data set, is extract what's happening to what type of behaviors may correlate to infants that are at higher risk versus not. We've now about 800 videos that we're going to reapply our first algorithm and see where the algorithm fails now that we have a lot bigger data set. And then now we're going to go back and revise that algorithm to see if we can disambiguate the low risk from the moderate risk. So this is our process. We're still in the process of analyzing the data set. I will say the last thing in challenges, and then I'll stop there, is we're looking at a multimodal space in terms of understanding behavior. The camera information, the information we get from the toy, and the information we get from the force sensor that the baby is placed on. Each of these data sets give us different understanding. And I think the challenge here is, how do we get better pose algorithms that will deal with issues of rollover? The clinician didn't put the baby in the center. The baby is a little bit more active than we thought. The baby is a lot bigger than we thought. And so still being able to extract meaningful data. And then the last thing I think is this place of how do you classify the interaction of the baby with the toy object due to occlusion, et cetera. It's often difficult to understand when the baby interacts with the toy. We get that from the toy itself. So we have them collect that data, but then the visual data, looking at and extracting it from the visual data is quite difficult. Where we're going is actually reinventing the toy to make the toy smarter and to use the machine learning classification algorithm inside the toy so that the toy actually becomes the center of that classification goal. So we're in the middle of doing that. I'll stop there, Francisco. Sorry.
Well, the moderator tells me who. Yeah. We have a.
So there's, in the computer vision community, there's pretty good progress in action recognition algorithms, including like multimodal language guided ones that could be self-supervised. And so I'm wondering, A, have you tried those? And then B, I mean, especially that last part, it looks like you're getting the perfect data for annotating and fine tuning them. But do you think in general, the field knows the set of activities we want to classify in order for us to actually create benchmarks and really push the computer vision community to like classify the things that would help us?
I think we're getting there. One of the key things that what we've looked at is manually annotating kind of annotating the actual behaviors. For example, in the last idea with the infant, kicking, what are those? There's enough data out there that says, okay, kicking gives us some sensitivity, center of pressure, rollover movement. So we're starting out, is the baby looking at the toy? Is the baby touching? Is the baby hitting? What's going on? So we're beginning to gather the type of behavioral information that might be indicative of motor action. We just hired a postdoc to work on that particular problem of looking into revising our algorithms so that they're able to actually classify these different behaviors. And one of the challenge is we went from just looking at having a top view camera to having 7 different cameras. So now we're looking into algorithms where you can go from 2D to 3D to reconstruct what's happening kind of from a 360, because we're realizing just having one camera, even though it's cheap and easy to get, may not be sufficient, especially when you have, you know, the robot or other objects in the field of view.
Great talk, Michelle. I had a really quick question going back to the sort of out in the wild observation of patients and therapists. And I was just curious, there's so much richness in like physical human-human interaction, especially in the nonverbal domain. And I was curious what your thoughts or practices have been in trying to, how do you capture that information, right? So how is the therapist actually physically manipulating the patient? And do you have ways of capturing that information either in video or through other means?
So working with an occupational therapist, we've been having their students curate the videos that demonstrate these different types of interaction behavior. One of the things that I've realized is I want also the kinematics of that interaction. How are they touching? How are they lifting, et cetera? So that part, I think, is an opportunity to develop those types of interaction. The information that we gathered from having therapists actually tell us, what does that mean when you're looking at this? This is actually a physical cue that caused a change in behavior, was actually really valuable, because then we realized that it wasn't as simple, that it wasn't just about the nonverbal, that the cues, the verbal cues and the physical cues actually precipitated the motions that we are looking at. And so to understand truly the interaction that you're just getting from a video that's silent, you actually want to understand some of the cues, because they often preceded why you would do a switch. Do you understand where I'm coming from? Okay.
I have a question regarding to the imitation learning. So I saw a lot of imitation learning require a large data sets. And then also what does the situation is different, because you also have two human. One is the therapist and the other is the patient. They all have variation. Have you thought about like capturing like this two humans variation? That's one, and two, the interaction dimension and how they interact. I felt like this is a very interesting question and very challenging.
Yeah. So with the learning from demonstration idea that we did, we only needed about 10 or so trials to capture or to predict that kind of trajectory, and from the therapist. We didn't learn from the stroke survivor in that case. We learned from the therapist and then use that to determine the trajectory, and then determine a control policy then that we had then the stroke survivor complete. And then we collected that data. So you could argue that we could then kind of reapply our learning to see if the person learned as well as the therapist. We didn't do that step. In terms of the interaction, it was separate. So the therapist interacted with the robot first, and then we transferred the information, and then the stroke survivor came in and interacted. In this case, it was almost like that triangle that we were working on. Hey, the therapist taught the robot what wanted to teach the patient, and then the patient was able to execute. I think we should close the loop, you know, and we're working on that. I think the challenge is we were stuck with simple tasks. But I think simple tasks are valuable for learning. But I definitely feel that that we're still kind of missing the ability to do a little bit of these more complex interactions, just because we haven't really developed the tools yet to fully do that. Okay.